Hello, I'm Anthony. Today I want to talk about the difficulties of preparing an environment ready for comparison. If I want to compare two products with each other, let's say two compressor plugins, I need some sort of level playing field upon which they can really show me their wares without any issue of loudness bias. In order to do that, I need to get some sort of baseline prepared, and it turns out that that's a really difficult thing to do. And the monitors themselves really don't help. They contribute to a lot of the confusion. I'm going to show you some of those pitfalls today, and I'm going to use two very popular monitoring tools as comparisons to show you how different monitoring plugins behave differently. It can actually be really difficult to define something as simple as zero. Here I've got Isotope's Insight and the T-Rax TR5 meter. Now they're both excellent monitors in themselves, but as you'll see, it's really difficult, really dangerous to presume that zero is zero everywhere. Let's have a quick chat about the test harness first. I've got this track of acoustic guitar, which ultimately we'll get to, but that's only right at the very end of the conversation. For the most part, I'm going to use this tone generator, the Waves tone generator. So in my track, I've got the tone generator ready to go. Then I've got my two monitors. And as you can see at the moment, I've got a compressor that is going to be introduced eventually. But at the moment, again, that's bypassed. So if I get the tone generator generating a sine wave, it's going in the background, I can turn the output down and have no effect on any of the metering. And this signal's going into both meters, and we see lots of really friendly, pleasant looking -12s everywhere. Here's one immediate problem. The moment you start looking at loudness, be very careful to presume that what you're seeing is actually -12. What we're getting here is something called a K-weighted loudness curve, and it just so happens that at 1 kilohertz, the test tone that's being generated here, that generates a reading on these meters of -12 loudness units. All I have to do is change the frequency of this sine tone generator, and these numbers are going to go wrong. So let's turn it randomly up to 2386. That's as good as anything else. I'll reset my meters. And now they're going to settle out at -9.3 loudness units. Every different point on the frequency curve is going to generate a different integrated loudness measurement. That's the whole point of loudness. It's fundamentally tailored to the human perception of frequency, and that human perception of frequency differs. We hear different frequencies at different loudnesses, and the meters take all of that into account. So we almost immediately fell into the trap of presuming that our loudness meters were all properly calibrated just because this sine tone generator happened to default to 1K. So here's the first takeaway. If you want some sort of scientific norm across all of your test environments, be very careful with loudness. It's fundamentally dependent on the signal being fed into it. At the moment, we have an absolutely constant sine wave. That's going to produce very consistent results, but totally variant and completely dependent on the frequency that's being sent in. Okay, let's stick that in our notebook and move on to another kind of measurement. Now we're going to have a look at peak output measurement. So what's the loudest that this signal ever reaches? Well, it's -12. This signal here, the gain of -12, is saying that that's the loudest the signal ever reaches. Or is it? The TR5 meter says it is, -12. Insight says it isn't. Insight's got -11.9, and you can see it's flickering. The number is flickering quite consistently. If I switch my meter reading to say, show me the highest peak you ever reach, now it's stabilized at 11.9. Let's set this back to 1 kilohertz. What's our true peak now? -11.3. And once again, every frequency value that I change, every time I update Insight, we're going to get a different value. This time we happen to get -12, but it's entirely frequency dependent. Back down to -11.3. All the time, TR5 is consistently saying, I am perfectly happy with -12, absolutely spot on. The reason for the discrepancy between these two numbers is this value down here is a true peak. In other words, it's calculating something called intersample peaks. No, I don't. That's a very long conversation. We don't really need to get onto it, but it's a completely perfect, absolutely accurate value. The value in the TR5 meter isn't a true peak value. In other words, it's not measuring bumps in between single measurements. So you've got a measurement here, minus 12, measurement here, minus 12. It's going to be minus 12 all the time. But in between, it's possible for audio signals to go above that level. Insight sees it. The TR5 meter doesn't see it. And we can make the TR5 meter see it by engaging use true peak. And now these two meters, frankly, should be measuring exactly the same. Let's go back down to 1 kilohertz, see if we can get some sort of consistency. There we go, at 1 kilohertz, they're now in complete agreement that the genuine true peak value being output by this sine wave generator is accurate. So there's your problem with peak measurement readings. Do you use true peak or not true peak? It's a decision to be made, perfectly reasonable to go down one avenue or another, but you need to know that this discrepancy is there. Okay, so true peak is okay. We might choose to use that as our kind of standardized point of reference. But true peak is a very dangerous measurement to read because it's literally a single instantaneous moment in time. Generally speaking, when we're performing loudness comparisons, we operate over much bigger periods of time. And that in turn splits into K-weighted loudness, which is the thing that's dependent on our human ears, and the more scientific mathematical base of averaging called root mean square, where you basically take a bundle of values over a period of time, let's say a second, you add all of those values up together, and then you divide by the number of measurements that you've taken to get the general average. The reason why you have to square every number and then do a square root at the end of the process is because audio is positive and negative. So by squaring all of those numbers, you flip the negative values to positive, so nothing is now below zero. So RMS is a great mathematical average to take. Let's use RMS, let's do that. So where are the RMS values on these 2 meters? Well, in Insight, it's a little bit small, unfortunately. I can't make the readout on Insight any bigger, but it's this number down here. You see it says minus 12. I'm going to put an asterisk on that. We'll come back to it in a minute. Let's have a look in TR5. Here's the RMS value, minus 15. So what on earth is going on? How can these two very highly regarded meters possibly be 3 decibels out as to their interpretation of the average of a sine wave? Well, it's all to do with that asterisk I put on my sentence a few moments ago, because minus 12 dB peak is not the same as minus 12 dB average. If the sine wave was generating a constant minus 12 dB signal, you'd never actually hear it. It would be a completely constant flat line control voltage, which doesn't generate sound. In order to have sound, you need fluctuations of energy. You go all the way up to +1, all the way down to -1, all the way back up to +1 again. And then at some later point in the process, you're going to decide what that +1 means. But this constant oscillation between positive and negative values, that's what generates volume. Now, when you take an RMS value and you flip all your negative values positive, you then need to take an average of all of that control voltage. Then you're into trigonometry here. You're dealing with sine waves, which is basically a constantly changing value. And it's possible to fairly easily calculate what's the midpoint of a sine wave that varies between 0 at its minimum and 1 at its maximum. I feel like I'm dodging my way through a rabbit hole minefield here. But what I'm basically going to do is I'm going to plug 45 into a calculator and ask it to generate the sine value for me. And we have this magic number, 0.707. That's the logarithmic representation of halfway. In sound terms, if 0 is your base point and 6 decibels is your upper point, let's say we're talking about a doubling of volume, which is 6 decibels, this value here represents 3 decibels. In other words, on a logarithmic curve, if you're describing a sine wave, and that sine wave is increasing in volume as sine waves do, and if this is your halfway point on the sine wave when you're at 45 degrees, this is 3 decibels of volume. So what I've basically just explained there is that the RMS loudness of a sine wave is 3 decibels less than its peak value. So if its peak value is 0, its RMS or average loudness will be minus 3 dB. The TR5 meter knows this. Here's its peak value at minus 12 dB. Here's its RMS value, exactly 3 decibels below. So the TR5 meter is complying with the laws of the universe. The Insight meter says that the true peak and the RMS are identical, both minus 12. Is it wrong? Well, actually, no, it isn't. It's kind of right. What the Insight meter is doing is conforming to an IEC standard. Now, a lot of this I've just done the reading on. I haven't read the 58-page document describing IEC 61606. And what that IEC document states, this global standard to which audio engineers are expected to comply, is that all measurements of a sine wave in all references should yield the same result. So regardless of whether you're measuring true peak or RMS or loudness, you should always get the same value. That's the standard against which all audio equipment is calibrated. And that's what the Insight meter is doing. It's saying, well, I know that my RMS and my peak values are supposed to be 0 when I'm measuring a sine wave. You're giving me a sine wave. I'm doing what I've been told to do. So basically what's happening under the hood is that Insight is adding 3 decibels onto its RMS measurement because it's being calibrated against a sine wave. And when and only when you send a sine wave into RMS, into Insight, you see that result manifested. Any other signal at all, you're going to get a different peak and RMS value. Let's send in some white noise. So now here's the white noise spread evenly across the entire frequency range. If I open my spectrum meter briefly, there we go. So this is basically, one is logarithmic and one is linear, which is why you're seeing a difference of scales. Don't worry about that. White noise is generating a signal across the entire frequency range, but it's not a constant signal. This signal is oscillating in amplitude terms quite wildly. In fact, by plus or minus 6 dB. Look at the true peak, minus 6.2. Very nearly 6, so basically got a range of up to 6 decibels, positive and negative, that these signals are allowed to generate their amplitudes. Insight sees that. And now it's measuring the peak at minus 6.2, but the RMS value at minus 13.7. Now, I've not looked at the TR5 meter yet, but I can tell you that it's going to be at minus 16.7 because it's going to be 3 decibels less than this value. And now, lo and behold, there we go. I look at the TR5 meter for the first time, and there's exactly 3 decibels difference between the two. Of course, Insight's toggling between 13.7 and 13.8. So there's your discrepancy for RMS values. Do you take the universal truth or the industry standard? Each of these meters have chosen to go a different way. So this is called the peak to RMS parity measurement. Insight is applying a peak to RMS parity. TR5 isn't. Some meters out there, I don't happen to own one, have a button that you can toggle the peak to RMS parity on and off, but you're basically seeing the manifestation of those two different results there. So all of this means it's unbelievably difficult to even get to any kind of baseline. Are you supposed to use sine waves? Are you supposed to use white noise? White noise is better than pink noise, by the way, because it's more consistent. It's more in terms of amplitude. You get a more regular signal out of it. So if you're ever wondering what to send into a device to generate some sort of baseline, you can use sine waves, you can use white noise, but they both have their idiosyncrasies and you need to understand what they are. Now let's get on to the practical applications of actually calibrating an instrument in our system. And I'll head back to sine waves because they're the purer form of measurement calibration. So we're back down to minus 12 on Insight, minus 15 on the TR5. So now with my sine wave generator still on, it is there. This sine wave is in the background. I've just turned it down. Now I'm going to engage my compressor, which is in the middle of the insert chain here. Turn my input all the way down, so the compressor's not doing any work at all. There's the signal going through the compressor. Now the circuitry of the compressor might be adding some colour. Let's have a look. In fact, it is. We've got a very, very slightly different RMS value. Now it's gone up slightly. we're at minus 11.8. So the compressor's adding some sort of coloration with the signal effectively passing it through it unprocessed. I'm not going to worry too much about that. I'm going to treat minus 12 as the baseline that I'm heading for. Now what I'm going to do is make the compressor do some work. As I turn the input up, you'll see, there we go, the gain reduction is starting to increase. I'm going to choose the level of gain reduction that I want to apply, let's say 4 dB. So I'm going to aim for 4 decibels of compression. And now when I look down at my meters, they're 4 decibels lower than they were because this amount of signal is being attenuated. The compressor is basically squashing the signal and it's now 4 decibels quieter than it used to be. Now I can bring the output level back up to the point where I'm back up at minus 12 RMS. It's a bit fiddly, there it is. So now the compressor's still working hard. It's doing 4 dB of compression on the signal, but I've introduced makeup gain to bring me back to the minus 12 that I was in the first place. So this compressor is now calibrated to a sine wave. Basically, that's the norm that I've specified. That's the norm that I've decided that I'm going to use for this particular test. And I can now calibrate all of the rest of my compressors to it. Something that's really important to understand, though, is that this 4 decibels of compensation, of calibration, only applies to a perfect sine tone. If I bypass the generator and now we go to listen to our audio signal, let's see what the total loudness readings are for this audio signal. It's running in the background. Here it is. So we've got an RMS. This is going to tail away, so I'm looking at this one. Minus 13, 14, 15. Got a loudness value of minus 17.7. The momentary peak at minus 14.6. So some numbers, okay? Let's concentrate on the loudness value of minus 17.7. What's going to happen when I send this same signal through the compressor? Once again, it's running in the background, doing its thing. Well, I calibrated this compressor to generate 4 decibels of compression. We've gone from minus 17.7 loudness units to minus 18.4. That's because this sound is dynamic. This is an acoustic guitar with all of the dynamic range that's involved in any audio signal that's not a sine wave. And so we're going to get a different set of results. All we've done with the calibration is established a flat sine wave based baseline. And that's okay for certain reasons, but it's not going to take into account the attack or the release of a particular signal, you know, what the dynamic qualities of this plugin are. It's purely dealing with an overall tone. I think it's a really valuable thing to have access to, but I wanted to draw your attention to just how many pitfalls there are when trying to develop any kind of baseline for doing any of these tests. Feel a desperate need for a cup of tea now. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks.